this is what television news is currently running with this hour. Polling will continue on today in some parts of Nigeria. Vavi keeps the media guessing ahead of a media conference this morning. And your sports news, Australia currently battling it out with New Zealand in the Cricket World Cup final. Let's look at the other stories that are making headlines on other media platforms. Our SABC radio bulletins are currently running with the story.
Latest on Nigerian elections, and one person killed and 16 injured in case of an accident. Good morning, I'm Zikona Miso.
SABC News Online is also leading with the following this hour. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to yet another exciting edition of Media Monitor and welcoming us into your homes. Now, Media Monitor is a platform where we discuss what makes news and why some issues have very little social impact, while others a huge impact. This Sunday, as we always do, we intend to deepen your understanding of the role of the media in our democracy while creating more awareness among TV viewers, radio listeners, newspaper readers, as well as users of news websites and social media. To be part of our discussions today, call us on the following numbers. It's +2 711 714 6843, 714 6847 and 714 6857, or interact with us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor. A very good morning to you. Yes, well, our guest this morning would like to welcome Cornelia van der Merwe, Africa News 24 editor, who joins us live from our Cape Town studios. And right here in studio, I have with me Ms. Paula Frey, the director of Frey Intermedia Panel. A very good morning to you. Let's start with you. A very good morning to you, Paula.
Good morning, Alicia.
Thank you so much for joining us. Cornelia, a very good morning to you in Cape Town. Thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor.
Good morning, it's a pleasure.
All right, well, let's have a look at those stories making headlines across our newspapers this morning. The Sunday Independent is leading with a Tsotsi minister after me. The Weekend Argus, now thieves target churches. City Press, Limpopo official racks up 100,000 pawn bill. And of course, the Sunday Tribune, there, high flyers who won't pay. Back here, Sunday Times, SA pilots mental shock. Let's now have a look at other headlines across Africa. Lesotho's Sunday Express, Ramaphosa to close SADC mission. The Nigerian Sunday Trust, Buhari wins big in Lagos, Ogun, Sogun. And of course, Swaziland Sunday Observer says the family lives in fear. All right, well, panel, let's start by looking at those front pages. A very big story today, Sunday Times front page, SA pilots mental health shock. Now, it has come out following the Germanwings crash that happened last week that, of course, South African pilots have been warned of an aviation time bomb due to the fact that it's not compulsory for them to have a proper mental health regulation that could possibly lead to such suicidal crashes. What do you make of this, Paula? I understand your husband is a pilot.
Yes. Well, it's quite an interesting follow-up to this week's crash with the German pilot who flew into the French Alps. And quite a timiest one too. The story essentially is saying that although they have to do medical checkups, it doesn't appear to be any extensive mental health checkup, and that some people are saying that this in fact is a time bomb because it really does rely on the pilots declaring that they're ill and seeking help for that. And we already know that from stigma, people are unlikely to do that. So quite an interesting story and a good follow-up to a big story during the week.
Very interesting indeed. Let's find out what Cornelia thinks. Cornelia, what is your view on this expose, especially after the Germanwings crash?
Well, I think the timing is interesting. that we have this information now about our local context. My concern is just that it's very difficult finding out whether there are pilots that have this kind of issues, because people simply won't report an issue when they are scared that they might lose their jobs. I know that internationally, some airlines have a system where a co-pilot might say that, listen, there's a problem with my colleague, please check it out, to make sure that there's a sort of a reporting line for this type of problem.
The debate really is it really part of the regulations for the pilots to have their mental health declared stable or not? Because apparently they only have one test that actually checks them out during the year, Paula.
And there doesn't seem to be, according to the story, a specific look at mental health, the state of their current mental health, which I think would be an essential thing. It does say that the CAA recently introduced a mood disorder protocol for airline staff aimed at minimizing the risk of suicidal reaction, suicide, chronic tiredness, etc. And it's quite interesting because we had a similar case in South Africa, well, not in South Africa, in Southern Africa, with a pilot with a plane going down in Angola last year.
Yes.
So one would have thought that would have raised alarms at the time in order for us to take some action.
It's interesting. It has to come out internationally before we actually heed the call.
Issue.
But let's look at also on the front page, just on the sideline of that there, it says the spy tapes, it's an apology to Roddy Casriels, of course, by the Sunday Times there, and they did put it in the front page, Paula.
It's an interesting apology. It's a result of a press council intervention. So the press ombudsman did in fact rule that the headline, Spy Tapes Illegal and Expose Casriel, was inaccurate, unfair and unnecessarily harmed Casriel's reputation. And the apology is in fact above the fold, in line with the status of the original story. And I think it's something that people have been calling for a long time.
Well, that just means that media needs to be very careful now in terms of what they put out there, especially in those big headlines. You need to have your facts straight. Let's move on now to City Press. Here's a headline here. Limpopo official backs up 100,000 rand bill for a porn site. Apparently, Deputy Speaker in the Limpopo legislature, namely Lehlohonolo Masoga, apparently ran up a cell phone bill of 125,000 rand, of which allegedly was the cost of some porn sites. While he was on an official overseas trip, the public protector is allegedly investigating the story. Cornelia, what are your views about this? Really, issues of public misspending. Every Sunday morning we get to read about them. Cornelia.
Well, yes, I think the problem is that in a country like ours, where there's such a big need for taxpayer money to be spent properly, to hear that a representative of the government is spending 100k on porn on his cell phone is very disappointing. And also, it makes one concerned about where else money is going, to the wayside, where it should actually be spent on helping to improve the lives of South Africans. I think the hammer is sure to come down hard on him.
Paula?
And it's another one of those stories that actually history repeating itself. It's not the first official who went overseas and racked up 100,000 rand or more on watching porn. What's really interesting is that the issue has to go to the public protector in order to be sorted out. And as you say, every Sunday morning we open the papers and there are stories of government officials spending our money.
It was consultants just a couple of weeks ago. Let's move on now to another story there from the Sunday Independence front page. It says here, Tsotsi, that is of course the CEO at Eskom, or chairman rather, says minister is after me. Well, according to Mr. Zola Tsotsi, he's implicated Public Enterprises Minister Lynn Brown as orchestrating all the moves to remove him from the parastatals board. Eskom's woes are just really deepening every week. The Medupi strike, more load shedding. Your views, please. And also, if you look at City Press, they're running with the story on page 2, saying that Eskom plans for a total blackout. Paula.
I know. I mean, again, this is an issue of a really critical state institution that just doesn't seem to be able to get its act together, either in terms of what it needs to be doing, but also who needs to be doing it. And so every week there are many more stories about the people in charge of the organization than the organization's ability to do things. It's quite interesting because the page 2 in City Press, the page 2 story on Eskom plans for a total blackout, I think is a good story in the sense that we do expect them to be doing crisis management, risk management. And so the fact that they are, in fact, doing a test to assess the country's readiness in case of a
total
blackout.
blackout.
While scary, is also encouraging that they
It's a
are
good
in fact
exercise.
doing their job. Absolutely. What's really fascinating, though, about the front pages that we see is that they're all very different. All of the front pages that you read out earlier on, all the front pages that we're looking now, every single one has a different news story. And that's quite encouraging because it means that there's a diversity of stories and issues coming across.
Cornelia, your views on this story?
Yeah, I can't see how the leader of ESCOM could, blame a government minister for being after him when his company is in so much shambles and it's affecting the entire country. Also, with all the resignations and eruptions within ESCOM itself, even if you leave load shedding outside of the picture, it is clear that there is a big problem, and he should more likely take responsibility rather than just play the blame game.
Thank you. We're seeing all this playing out in court ahead of this huge investigation that's going to take 3 months. So we'll be waiting with bated breath to see what really comes out. Well, stay tuned for more Media Monitor shortly after this break. Welcome back to Media Monitor. Well, Nigeria held democratic elections, and of course, yesterday, after a 6-week postponement due to security concerns, polling will continue today in some areas where new machines largely failed to read voters' biometric cards. Now, panel, very interesting. We might be crossing live to see what's happening in Nigeria, but I just want to hear your views, Paula, in terms of there was reported violence. Also, we might just get to clarify that in a short while. What do you think about those polls so far?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting because given the scale of elections in Nigeria, we've got, we can anticipate some problems around the election process. And certainly when they announced that elections were continuing today, they did say that although there were problems, the scale allowed them to, encourage them to actually postpone it, but it wasn't on such a scale as to affect the election's credibility at all. There was some violence yesterday. There was talk of up to, I think, 12 people killed in various incidents across the country. I mean, the interesting thing, certainly from a South African coverage point of view, is how we've underplayed, I think, these elections. If you look at certainly the English newspapers that we have in front of us today, we see that only on the front page of the Sunday Independent is there a photograph of President Goodluck Jonathan. But really, the coverage has been fairly muted. It could be that the elections, that we're certainly in the process of elections and there are no results, because we tend to be very kind of result or event-oriented. But I would say that it's an underplaying of a major story on the African continent.
Let's look at the Boko Haram scare going to the elections. I mean, they threatened to disrupt polling stations. Now, we heard about twin bomb blasts yesterday in 2 different areas. And apparently the slogan there by one of the witnesses says that the gunman that came to attack them was saying, "Didn't we tell you to stay away from the polls?" And apparently the Nigerian government is still not doing enough to curb this.
Well, certainly Boko Haram is a major issue, and the elections were postponed for 6 weeks because of the security concerns. But people came out yesterday. Even displaced persons came out to vote. People came out in their droves. And given that, I think that we can certainly see that the elections process is encouraging. And it's interesting because Nigeria had military rule until 1999, and Goodluck Jonathan's party, the Progressive Democratic Party, People's Democratic Party, has been ruling since then. So I think that there's certainly indications that Muhammadu Buhari stands a very good chance today, and so I think this is something that we should be watching with all eyes.
And in terms of Buhari, everybody's saying that, he's a prodigal son that's returned to save the nation. Do you think that really Nigerians have such a huge faith in the fact that he might turn around the current state of things in Nigeria, Paula?
Well, certainly on social media, there was a lot of, and social media is a really good place to be following news from the continent. Certainly on social media, there was a lot of optimism yesterday that the democratic process of voting could bring about change.
And let's look at, of course, now the election results. We don't know how long it's going to take. There was huge delays in terms of the new voter cards and the biometric cards, and apparently even Goodluck Jonathan himself couldn't vote because his tablet couldn't read his own information. Do you think these new systems really do work in times of election? We've seen them in Namibia or in Zambia when they've just been introduced, Paula.
I think we'll always have teething problems when a new system is introduced. And certainly some of the issues yesterday were just that. They were teething problems. Once things had been corrected, the process has certainly sped up, and people were able to register and people were then able to vote. In some areas, we had a situation where election materials had not arrived and people were still waiting for officials. I think it's quite important that we use technology to make our elections as fair as possible and as easy as possible in order to go out there and collect votes and then to be able to count votes accurately.
This is a very hotly contested election. Well, we'll definitely be keeping you updated in terms of developments right here on SABC News and, of course, all our shows. But let's go back to our inside stories. I think, Paula, we really need to look. There's a huge story there. And, of course, it comes from the Sunday Independence, page 8. It says, embattled Vavi set to throw in the towel. Now, Vavi has got tongues wagging as to what's going to happen after he tweeted famously yesterday that he's going to hold a conference and he wasn't going to say more about it. Cordelia, your views about Vavi's tweet and what is expected today, please.
Well, I think a lot of people are wondering whether Vavi would simply just say, well, I've had enough, I'm resigning. But obviously, should he resign, that really would have quite an important impact on different parties and as well as on just, COSATU in general. But the fact that he's actually got a big announcement, I think, in my view, it is likely that he would just say, you know what, I've had enough, and just not care about the fallout, for COSATU in general.
Well, everybody's speculating in the papers here that he's set to resign. What do you think, and what's going to happen to COSATU without Vavi, Paula?
Well, the Vavi issue has been kind of hampering, I think, many issues within the union, and so interesting that Vavi decided to announce his press conference on Twitter yesterday. Instantly got the Twitterati commenting and everyone in quite a flutter.
As he always does. He's such a media propaganda.
So I think, his press conference today could do one of two things. Either he's going to use that as an opportunity to put his case ahead of the CEC meeting, the Central Executive Committee meeting tomorrow, where he is facing some issues around the forensic audits into COSATU and allegations against him. So I think he could either be doing that, but there seem to be quite a number of indications in the different newspapers that he might actually decide that he's had enough, that he's going to leave and he's going to move on. The question then, of course, is whether he moves on to a separate workers' union. And then I think COSATU's troubles might just be beginning.
Well, I was just about to ask that there's always been speculation that he'll either join NUMSA or start a new federation. Cornelia, what do you think he'll do?
I think NUMSA are, one of the parties that is really interested in what Vavi is going to say this afternoon. because should he resign, it's likely that they would approach him and say, listen, join our ranks. And then COSATU would have a lot of problems, because then the power that NIMSA has will increase, So I'll eagerly await to see whether, if he resigns, and if he does resign, whether he joins NIMSA.
All right, let's move on, of course, now to Eskom. And of course, Eskom, that was the other story. I think we discussed it also in the front pages, that they're actually planning to do a total blackout in the country. What do you think this is going to do? I know you did touch on it a little bit, Paula, but let's go deeper into it.
I'm not sure that they're planning to do a total blackout. The story seems to be indicating that they're preparing for the eventuality of a total blackout, and making sure that these systems are able to cope. I think that's a good thing. I would expect such a major organization to be doing risk management, to be testing systems. And so I'm not sure that the story is shock horror if you're tired, as we are, of the constant load shedding. But it's also a reassuring story if you're thinking, are these guys actually thinking ahead? And it certainly would seem to indicate that perhaps someone there is.
Cornelia, your views on Eskom?
Yeah, personally, I find it quite sad that this is the situation we're in. But I also agree that it's encouraging that Eskom are thinking what would happen if we had a total blackout. Without any sort of preparation, the disaster, the damage to our economy and the country in general would be massive. So should we get to that point where it's necessary to go to a total blackout, at least if we can minimize the damage, that would be the best case scenario for a pretty horrible situation.
I think we really need to be aware of what would happen. We need to be prepared. It's just like drills, basically, Paula. So people should not be shying away from it.
Well, actually, the situation is a little bit more scary than that, because one of the things that we often underestimate is the impact that electricity has on our water supply, for example. No electricity, no machines to actually push water through the system, no machines to fill up dams, etc. So when you're thinking of electricity, it's not that we just don't have lights in our homes. It's everything comes to a standstill. Water comes to a standstill. Factories come to a standstill. Traffic lights, everything comes to a standstill. And so looking at this, preparing for such an eventuality, I think is critical.
Those people on life support in hospitals, it's quite scary. Last but not least, panel, I'm told that we must do this. The Sunday Independent, there on page 2, Hawks boss swoops on Unit's head in Limpopo. Well, apparently Ntlhameza now is zoomed in on Hawks head in Limpopo, General Debero Malajana, who's been suspended in connection with a number of allegations, among them using junior police officers to transport her sons to school. Well, it's like a drama episode. Every week there's always a new piece of information. There's also news on Dramat coming out linked to Ngasana. What do you make of this development now?
Well, I mean, it's quite... One of the things that emerges from a lot of the stories that we saw today, whether it's the Vavi story, whether it's the Hawk story, is that very often we're being told what's happening. Vavi is going to have a press conference. This is, these are the potential options that he's going to talk about. Hawk suspends its Limpopo head, and this is why. What we don't get told is really whether this is part of how this fits into the bigger picture of what's happening with the Hawks. Every week you're saying that we have a story of someone being suspended, something happening, but we don't really get told who are the factions, who's on whose side, who's doing what, why is this happening, and what are the consequences of this happening. Because if so many people are being suspended from the Hawks, you wonder if anyone's actually doing any investigations.
If anybody's at work, for that matter, Paula.
Exactly.
Well, let's take a look at one tweet that was sent through, of course, on the topic of Mr. Vavi. Let's see if we can get that tweet up. All right, we won't take that tweet now. We're going to take a quick ad break. We'll be back with more Media Monitor shortly after this. Stay with us.
Cultures of Africa, though similar in some ways, are colorful and diverse.
We explore the rich culture, dance and dress of the Tanzanian people of the Mtwara region.
The dance that they're performing is what you will find in the village. And it's not just a paid gig, it's something they do they enjoy.
Dwara's late development has left it with a rich reservoir of empirical knowledge of a purer African life.
For whatever the reasons are, it's one of the last areas of the country to develop, and thus traditional arts and traditional culture.
That's Kaleidoscope, Sundays, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
This is Media Monitor. Welcome back. Well, very big news this week. Students at the University of Cape Town have questioned the way in which controversial apartheid-era figures, national monuments and statues continue to be memorialized. Opinions are polarized over the statue, with some parties saying the statue should be removed from its prominent position but not destroyed. However, student activists insist that the aim is to transform the university and the country at large by implementing a rigorous political education that interrogates neocolonialism narratives pertaining to Africa. Now, this debate has brought into sharp focus the need to set up a committee to look into all issues pertaining to apartheid relics. Let's have a look at this clip.
The emotive issue of the Cecil John Rhodes statue has gained momentum and spread to other universities across the country. It has also revived debate in Zimbabwe regarding the renewed call for the exhumation and repatriation of Rhodes' grave to the United Kingdom. The crux of the debate is around history, whether it should be erased or embraced as it forms part of who we are.
Well, we'd like to now welcome Advocate Sonwabile Maqotywa, the CEO of the National Heritage Council of South Africa, in our Cape Town studios to analyze the defaced statue of Cecil Rhodes by students at the University of Cape Town. She's sitting there alongside Cornelia. Advocate, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor.
Morning.
Now, Advocate, let's start with
morning
you.
To listeners.
Let's start with you, Advocate. Is it really acceptable to edit or erase certain parts of our history? Doesn't our history make us who we become in the future?
I think once more the issue of the destruction of statues, more especially the defacing of Cecil John Rhodes, has put the issue of memorials and statues into the public domain, and also the importance and the role of memorials as symbols of people's, as symbols of power relations, and but also the importance of social cohesion and nation building in our society. The Heritage Council, as a body that is responsible for policy, more especially our mandate of advising the Minister of Arts and Culture on policies to be enacted to promote our heritage. We trace this issue because it's important to locate this issue or give it its proper context. That in South Africa, because of the manner in which our political transition happened from the previous order to the democratic dispensation, we have not seen the wholesale destruction of statues and memorials like other countries that have gone through mass insurrection and revolution in that way. Because of the unique nature, we had a policy of reconciliation. So we've seen uncoordinated, sometimes removal of statues and memorials, like the statue of Verwoerd in Midvaal municipality. So all of these have compelled us in the Heritage Council to come up with a policy. We commissioned a study of experts, and they came up with a draft policy guideline. And if you look at those draft policy guideline, there is also a benchmarking, that is case studies that have been done internationally as to how other countries have looked at this issue, which means that the best practice, out there. And there are certain recommendations that the team or panel of experts is coming up with. One of those, for instance, is the audit of all apartheid and the colonial statues in South Africa. But of course, the second one is to flesh out the guidelines on erection and removal of statues, but also differentiating between history and heritage, because history is everything that is out there, what historians make of history, events of the past. But when it comes to heritage, it's not what we choose. In fact, heritage is what we choose, but history is not what we choose. So countries take conscious decision as to what will make their own heritage. So the question that I will be asking South Africans, more especially as we take the policy guidelines out there, that this distinction between history and heritage is very much important. To say that how would we want in our own public spaces, how would we want to inspire, to embrace as our own common heritage, our own common identity in South Africa? In other words, what would you like to see in our own public spaces, and what that which you want to embrace and inspire, generations, current and future. But at the same time, how do we remind ourselves of our painful past? There are various ways to do that. Other countries, for instance, they will put those monuments and statues that reflect their ghastly past in less prominent positions, or else in theme parks, narrate them, but not celebrate them. But at the same time, take those that reflect their own, how the world would love to view them, take them to prominent spaces and celebrate them. So these are whole issues that are coming up in our policy, a draft policy that will be taken out to the public to test the views of South Africans. Otherwise, removal or erection of statues, it should follow certain heritage protocols. It can't just be done. Because as I'm saying that the distinction between history and also heritage is very much important. We would want to be reminded about our own painful past, in as much as we would want to see or celebrate that which is common to us. Advocate. That which would have, yes.
Thank you so much, Advocate. He mentions a very important point there, that just because it hurts, you don't have a right to remove it. It is part of our history. Now, Paula, this issue has even sparked cross-border debate, with Zimbabwe now back at the fold of talks about what should be done about Rhodes' grave in Zimbabwe. Are we really approaching this matter in a holistical way that we should be?
So the issues that have arisen at the University of Cape Town and the University of Rhodes are sparked, I think, to some degree by the fact that we've been so slow about talking about our history and challenging the current representation of our history. And I find it really interesting that UCT has now voted, in fact, to remove the statue of Rhodes from its property and to ask the Heritage Council to actually have a look at that and where it should go. I agree with you that we cannot simply erase what we don't like of our history, but how we treat that, I think, is important. So do we honor someone like Cecil John Rhodes when we know what the character of the man, when we know what his actual contribution was? Do we, give him pride of place at one of Africa's top universities? So do we honor his memory, or do we recognize his role in our history and pay tribute to it accordingly?
I thought it was, what's happened has happened. We must forgive and forget and move on. But let's have a look at what the viewers at home are saying about this particular topic. Let's see those tweets there. All right, Khosi Nyati says our past, no matter how sad and evil, forms a vital cog of our heritage. I'm not sure if I can see that word correctly there. I think it's cog. Thank you so much. H.P. Ntuli says wiping history, whether good or bad, is not a good idea. We need to accept where we come from. Thank you so much to all our viewers for your tweets there. Cornelia, this story was big in Cape Town about 2 weeks now in a row. In your views, what do you make of the students bringing this issue up?
Well, to me, it's been a very interesting debate because I've recently joined UCT as a postgraduate student. So as a journalist and a South African, and also now as a student, I have a very big interest in this. I agree that you can't just erase your history, but I also question whether having a statue of Cecil John Rhodes at such a prominent place of UCT, the place where the statue is just above the Jamie Steps, which is sort of a congregation point for many UCT students. It seems like a celebration where I think we can take note of the contribution that Cecil John Rhodes made maybe to academics. But in general, I think that the sentiment towards him is so negative that it doesn't make sense for the university to have that statue at such a prominent point, and that is part of what the students are protesting. But it seems that the university, at least the Vice-Chancellor, has now said that he is asking the university to remove the statue and move it to a different spot. And so that now has to follow a process at the university before we will know whether that will happen.
Advocate, please, do you think that the committee formed to look at these issues will actually hold water? I mean, there were so many steps to be considered before removing a historical memoir, and maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. But Advocate, my issue here is we've seen great upheaval when it comes to replacing some of these, the renaming of places as well as roads. Why the need to replace parts of our history then?
You'll agree with me that the whole issue of social memory becomes very emotional. I mean, countries go to war because of the social memory, and that certain groups actually feel that their dignity is not respected and so forth. So it's a very important issue. Whether we talk of renaming of places, because we are talking here about decolonization of our heritage, decolonization of our history. So you'll have that because people want to see change. But people want to see themselves as part of an embrace or their own heritage embraced. But at the same time, as I was saying, the UCT episode is not the first one. We have seen, for instance, the Dagen village. We have seen the King Shaka Memorial defacing, or of that statue. We have seen a number of them in the country. But we've also seen good practices in South Africa. For instance, the statue of Herzog was removed in Union Building and replaced with the statue of Madiba. And there was negotiation with the family, and it was put in a less prominent position. That is why in the Heritage Council, if you look at our policy or draft policy, we're looking at this, we're asking this question, that is very important to say that how do we remind ourselves about our bitter past. We've seen Cubans, for instance, that they have managed to remind themselves about the history of Batista, one of the most fearless dictators, and as part of their own public memory, without sanitizing it or without celebrating it. So what I'm hearing even here today in this discussion is that you can remind we need to actually remind ourselves of our own bitter past, how painful it is. But we can do that without sanitizing it or celebrating it. Hence, we need to differentiate between what we want to embrace or inspire the new generation, or what is positive to us, but also what is painful to us, which we should not forget about. Because the fact that we're talking of justice in South Africa, it is because there was injustice.
Thank you so much,
The fact that we're talking about humanity, it is because there was inhumanity. So those are two things that we need to juxtapose and say that how do we remind ourselves and how do we embrace and in our own public spaces.
Thank you so much, Advocate. Well, everybody is suggesting that since there will be a pre-democracy audit of those statues, why don't you just put all of them in one place where everybody can go and have a look and say, well, these are the pre-democracy statues. Well, thank you so much once again, Advocate Sonwabile, for joining us. That was Advocate Sonwabile Maqontyo talking to us about the road statue. We're going to take a quick ad break, and when we come back, we're going to analyze the closing down of one of the historic news wires agencies, SAPA, shortly after this break. Stay with us.
In Africa, mobile devices are tools to make payments, browse the internet, and keep governments in check with social media forums.
It's given an average African too much power in their hands.
And tech creativity is solving some of the continent's problems.
Everything is internet driven.
And on Network, we tell you how Africans are using technology and social media in their everyday lives.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
welcome back. As promised now, one of the oldest institutions of news dissemination in the country, South African Press Association, is closing down permanently on March the 31st. That is on next week, Tuesday. Paula, what are your views? I mean, how will this closure of SAPA impact on the dissemination of news in South Africa?
You know, Alicia, it really is the end of an era. When I was a junior reporter 30 years ago, one of the big things was that as a young reporter, you would go out and do a story, a press conference, and you would rush back to the office and try and get your story through before SAPA did. And you never beat SAPA. SAPA was always there first with the story. It's an end of an era for another reason too. I think it's an end of an era in which South African media have cooperated with each other and have built together, you know, an institution like the South African Press Association. It's been around for almost 8 decades. It's 76, 77 years old. And when it sends out its last story on Tuesday, it's really going to be the last time that all media houses actually share the resources in order to produce a steady stream of stories. I mean, newsrooms have relied for years on the SAPA diary. Newsrooms have relied on SAPA being able to send them court reports, crime reports, basic stories of what's happening on that day. And what happens after this is going to be really very, very interesting.
And I really was going to ask, how did SAPA aid you in your journalism days? But you started with that. Thank you so much, Paula. Let's find out from Cornelia. Cornelia, you tell us, how will the closure of SAPA actually impact South African news?
Well, in my context, I work for online news, and we really depend on SAPA to get to the parts of South Africa where we simply don't have the resources to put reporters. Also, you know, you can imagine that 77 years of doing business, the SAPA diary, for instance, is legendary. The person that manages that diary is also legendary, you know, just because they stretch all across the country and they can get the news that everyone is interested in, but not everyone has access to. So it really is a sad time for South African journalism. I know SAPA sent out a brief to a lot of journalists last week that they will open their offices on Tuesday afternoon for people that just want to come and basically, you know, type a message of encouragement, say goodbye to the staff. You know, it really is sort of a moment in time that I think a lot of old school South African journalists will not quickly forget.
Well, I got introduced to SAPA when I started doing news, and I can't believe when you actually look at it, every footnote of any news stories that you read, you'll see the SAPA caption at the bottom. So I've also grown up into it. But what role would you say SAPA played post-democracy and in our democratic era, Paula?
So if you look at what SAPA actually does in its ability to push out stories really quickly, I think one of the essential roles that it played was in an era when there were many stories. And we really are talking about a pre-internet era. I mean, today we can go online and we can look for stories and we can look for information. But very often SAPA was there sending out information, sending out stories that newspapers could pick up. Then when newspapers themselves are able to actually find a lot of the information or be able to cover the stories as they were breaking because of the internet, one of the things that SAPA did was to be able to coordinate resources so that you could focus on the special story. If you were the news editor, when I was the news editor of the Star newspaper, we would focus on the special stories of the day, knowing that we could absolutely trust that SAPA would do the bread and butter stories, the court stories, the crime stories, the political statements. And I think one of the issues that has happened is that the media itself has evolved to such an extent that the role of SAPA has been diminished or certainly is no longer appreciated as it used to be.
And Paula, you know, you mentioned something earlier that we don't get to read about African stories in South African newspapers, and SAPA was your go-to area. I mean, look at all the developments now with Boko Haram and the elections. Where are we going to get all those interesting African stories
Well,
from?
you know, I mean, one of the issues that you kind of indicated that SAPA's imminent demise was the fact that people began pulling out of SAPA last year. And I think in September, AFP pulled out of SAPA. And so increasingly what you're finding was that kind of sharing that media used to have wasn't happening anymore. Fascinating that now, when SAPA dies on Tuesday, On Wednesday, we're going to have 3 syndication or news wire agencies, one by BDFM, one by Independent Media, and one by Media 24. And so the very same people that couldn't hold it together to keep SAPA going are now bringing out their own agencies or syndication services.
I was about to say there's rumor that a new news agency is actually going to take over. But here's what Bongani Mafilika thinks on Twitter. He says, SAPA closing March 31st. Well, things come and go in life. Really, that is his view. Thank you so much for that input from all our tweeters and, of course, our viewers at home. Paula, what do you think will be prominent in the news this week? We've got Eskom. We've got Vavi making an announcement. We've got endless stories about what's going on in IPID, in the security cluster. What do you think is going to be prominent?
Well, I do think that Nigeria should be an important story for our news agenda this week. Definitely Vavi's press conference today is going to set off an issue that will be followed up tomorrow when the Central Executive Committee meets. And so the Vavi story. And then Eskom just appears to be an ongoing story. In fact, all of the parastatals appear to be giving the minister
They're not load shedding in the news. Let's find out from Cornelia. Cornelia, what do you think will be prominent in the news this week? Are we going to see more of roads? I mean, the final decision is set to be taken this week.
Yes, I'm sure at least in the Western Cape, the UCT story will continue to get a lot of airtime. I'm also hoping that Nigeria's election will be prominently displayed in our media. I also find it quite interesting that there's really not a lot in the papers today about Nigeria's election. It really is now the biggest country, most populous nation in Africa, and the economy is sizable. What happens in Nigeria now impacts the rest of Africa. So it will be interesting to see if Buhari actually manages to upset Goodluck Jonathan and whether there's any post-election violence over the next few days. We really hope not.
Yes, Cornelia, I just wanted to find out, why do you think that the Nigerian story didn't make any front pages, in your view? Is it because SAPA is going?
Well, you never know, it might be. Well, I've seen a lot of interest from the international publications, from CNN to BBC, The Guardian in the UK. They all really are following the elections closely. It seems like it's just us that's a bit slow in the uptake. But maybe we're waiting for a result. That could be it. Also with the elections, the issues and a bit of delays and so on, maybe some people are waiting to see how today goes. Voting will still continue today in some areas where they could not vote yesterday.
Look, I find it very interesting that the Lesotho election seemingly got a little bit more coverage. Why do you think it's not being covered in a way that it should be, Paula?
So there certainly was more direct South African involvement in the Lesotho election, with the Deputy President actually leading the SADC delegation there. So I can understand that. I think that very often we don't see the importance of summer stories in Africa. We don't see that this is the biggest economy, most populous nation, and very, very critical for the continent. We often see ourselves in isolation of the continent and not part of the continent, quite frankly.
Thank you so much to my panelists today. Cornelia van der Merwe in Cape Town. She's the Africa News 24 editor. And with me here in studio, Ms. Paula Frey Intermedia. She is the director of Frey Intermedia. Well, it is that time again when I have to remind our viewers that your contributions and suggestions are highly valued. To engage with us, you can follow us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor. Share your views and comments on Facebook. Go to www.facebook.com/Media Monitor and tick like on our page. You can also email us your views about the show. Our email address is mediamonitor@sabc.co.za. Thank you once again for watching Media Monitor. Do join us again next week. And in case you missed this live show, remember you can still catch the repeat tomorrow morning at 2 a.m. I'll still be up. Or go to our SABC YouTube link on www.youtube.com/SABC News. For myself, Alicia Jali, my panelists and the QTIV team, it's a blessed Sunday. Goodbye.